How do creatures survive all kinds of environments? What innate features enable them to continuously adapt to geologic and environmental conditions? Our guest today will talk about increasing evidence that God engineers creatures with amazing abilities. We'll learn how they detect changes in myriads of external conditions and make suitable self-adjustments. Coming up on today's edition of Origins, Creatures Engineered Adaptability with Dr. Randy Guliuzza. To Origins. I'm Ray Heiple. It's an honor to be your host today. During this program, we showcase interesting guests who present evidence from science along with other important facts, validating the truth of creation and the accuracy of the Bible. Today's guest, Dr. Randy Guliuzza, has undergraduate degrees in engineering and theology and a Master of Public Health from Harvard University. In 2008, he retired as a lieutenant colonel from the U.S. Air Force as a medical doctor. Now he's a speaker and author for the Institute for Creation Research in Dallas, and he has represented ICR in several scientific debates. Welcome, Dr. Guliuzza.
Well, thank you so much, Ray. It's always a blessing.
Well, we'd love to have you here once again. We're talking about creatures' engineered adaptability.
Yes, we want to move everyone's thinking to seeing creatures, not just engineered, but engineered to be these problem-solving, active entities that are able to take on all different kinds of environmental challenges and succeed and fill those niches. That's where we're going with this whole thing. Now, if God made the earth a very dynamic place, which it was, He couldn't put on it static creatures because they would be overwhelmed. If He has a dynamic earth, He has to make dynamic creatures, which means they have to be able to change a little bit. But the fact that they are able to change, in other words, the fact that they are adaptable, is what really gives evolutionary thinking its basic legs. Because if organisms could never change, then you could never get a theory of evolution going, because it's based on the fact that they can change. So this whole idea right here, adaptability, everything is going to spin on explaining how organisms actually change.
So we both agree here, right? Creationists and evolutionists both agree that there is adaptability in creatures.
Right, there is.
We're talking about where did that come from?
And how does it work?
How does it work?
How does it work? So let's see if we can change our thinking a little bit here. Let's look at this brand new ship. It's a submarine hunter. It's put out by the Navy, and it's an incredible feat of human engineering. And it tracks down submarines. Now the question is, does the submarine actually make this thing move? And how does this ship actually work? Well, it says there it's a new vessel. It's going to patrol all the world's oceans, and it's going to do it without not a single person on board.
Wow.
This is an incredible drone. It's actually a drone, and it's driving itself all around the oceans of the world. And it's doing it because this baby is tracked with state-of-the-art sensors. Right there. It is studded with all different kinds of sensors for everything that this submarine is putting out. And it's coupling those sensors with all different kinds of programming. Sorry, this is motion there, but
yes.
Everybody knows where I'm going with that. The question is, does this submarine cause that ship to change its direction? Or, the better question is, does the ship change itself? What is the cause? Now we're dealing with some ideas of causality here. What's really making this happen? And the only way you really know for sure is you actually have to look inside that ship. You need to look inside it, see what's making it operate, and see how it's functioning. And that's exactly what we have to do with creatures. Are they being driven by their environment through space and time? Or do they drive themselves through space and time? And the only way you know that is to look inside the creatures as well. So, I need to kind of go up and illustrate some things for you right here.
This is a really interesting concept. So, we can observe the adaptability of this submarine or this submarine hunter, we can see it, but we don't know what's making it happen.
What's making it happen. And so we end up going into nature, exact same thing. We see a lot of results, we see environmental conditions, and we want to know, how did it get this way and how does it operate? So you see a little desert environment, and we look at these little dogs here, these little chihuahuas, and they seem to fit that desert environment so well. They're small, they have short hair, and they like that desert environment. Well, the question is, how do they get that way and how does it operate? Well, the typical story is that all different kinds of dogs were exposed to that desert environment. And after they were exposed to that desert environment, a lot of them died. It's a death-driven view. This dog didn't make it, that dog didn't make it, this dog didn't make it. But, aha, a small short-haired dog survived, and that's why they live in this condition. So you can see the environment is kind of running the show. The environment is molding things. And a lot of times I read in scientific literature that the environment can actually induce these changes. It causes changes to happen inside a creature. Is that true?
That's a good question.
That's a great question.
We would need to try to figure that out.
Does the environment actually induce changes? Is it wiping everything out, just leaving a few survivors? Is that really what's happening when organisms are able to fit into new environments? Well, this gentleman right here, building the most complex structure on Earth, he's talking about living creatures. In everyday parlance, environmental stimuli are said to induce or even regulate expression of specific genes. This notion is so engraved in the biological conception system that it comes as a revelation when, upon closer examination, it turns out that no external stimuli that could directly induce the expression of any gene are known. Basically this: nothing goes directly from the environment to your genes to a trait that you express directly. You are exposed to conditions and you express your own genes. You regulate the expression of your own genes. It is not the environment. The problem is everybody is taught this and it's so engraved, it's hard to get this out of people's thinking.
Would it be fair to say that the environment is the condition but not the cause?
Exactly. And conditions don't directly change things unless your body knows they are a condition. So, environments do not directly induce any of the genes inside this little dog right here. In fact, we know by studying the mane of lions. That's an interesting, why do some have a big mane, why do some of them have a small mane, that they actually have programmed results within them, and they are able to detect rainfall, they're able to detect temperatures, and when those things change, the mane changes. They change the manes themselves. As you said, the environment is just the condition, and the organism is able to detect those changes themselves. And they make those adjustments. So they detect, and they have innate designed mechanisms which enable them to self-adjust to all these different conditions. So that leads us to a real important question. How in the world do organisms relate to their environment over time? We know that they relate, but how do they relate to their environment? What if a fish found itself in a cave in total darkness? Boom. How does it get to this state where it no longer has eyes when it's found in a condition of total darkness and you end up with a blind cave fish? Well, we're asking the question, how do they relate to their environment over time? And is there this is one of your favorite words, purpose for that relationship? And not only is there a purpose for that relationship, is there a mechanism which regulates that relationship? And if there is a mechanism, where is that mechanism found? In other words, how do you go from these sighted fish to an unsighted cave fish? What is the process for getting there? We're actually going to answer that question when we get towards the end of this talk. In other words, do environmental challenges, does this cave shape these organisms over time? Or Do they have innate mechanisms right inside them that shape themselves to the environment over time? And this is not semantics. We're looking at where the causality really resides with these creatures. Programmed ability with design parameters. It will operate within those parameters, which is its range of adaptability, and that's exactly what engineers would do. Well, if we're going to answer this question, we need to look inside some of these creatures to find out exactly what is happening. And it goes right back to philosophy, another one of your favorite topics here. And there's two different philosophies. One is called externalistic, and this is really what Darwin championed here, is this idea that the environment, externalistic, goes by all these other names, is really what's changing and molding and shaping creatures. And I'll show you a quote to support that.
Okay.
Versus what I would suggest is probably more likely what's happening, and all the evidence seems to be going that way, internalist. It's their internal mechanisms, it's their internal programming, which is able to shape themselves, adjust themselves over time.
And that programming is activated, as it were, depending upon where it is.
What it finds in its conditions. Now, this book right here, Plausibility of Life, written by two really pretty eminent researchers, Kirshner and Gerhardt, they're going to explain part of Darwin's theory. And they're actually going to resolve a dilemma that he has. In other words, where does this basic form come from? But they do a very good job right at the very beginning of explaining how externalism became the dominant view which has basically overtaken all of our educational institutions. And they say this about Darwin. He, that was Darwin, accepted the view that the environment, look at this key word, directly instructs. There's like an agency involved in the environment. The environment directly instructs the organism how to vary, and he proposed a mechanism for inheriting those changes, and of course that was natural selection.
Well, that's a loaded phrase, because to instruct implies intelligence, implies purpose.
Right, all of those things. And because he saw the environment acting as an agent, the organism was like modeling clay. And in other words, the environment is molding and shaping the organism a little bit over time. In other words, if you needed a new feature, the environment would be able to shape it into the organism. But
it sounds like the environment is God.
It does, it is. And the question is that true? Do the organisms really react and respond like modeling clay? Are they really being shaped by their environment over time? So we need to look at another way of explaining this, maybe an internalistic way. And so knowing how design things operate is very, very crucial to explaining how living things operate. And this, unfortunately, is an area where all of us need to work on, is knowing how design functions. So the first thing we need to recognize, something that you know as a pastor, is that the earth has always been a dynamic place. There was day and night, there was seasons, and it's always been a little challenging, not lethally challenging, but challenging enough to where organisms needed to overcome those challenges. And so since the earth had some specific conditions on it, that it was dynamic, organisms had to have some basic design features. First, they have to be stable. They are going to reproduce faithfully after their kind. So you're going to have a dog kind, a horse kind, a cat kind. You're going to have all these different kinds there. So there has to be a type of stability there, but they also have to be dynamic enough to take on all of these different changes on the earth. And even the act of filling the earth, when one creature moves into a niche of another, it changes it for that creature. From an engineering perspective, if you have stable and dynamic, what you really have are organisms that we would call, as an engineer, they're robust. They're able to function, take a licking, and keep on ticking, so to speak. But they also have to be plastic. They have to be a little flexible on that. And when you have robustness and plasticity, what we would frame that as an engineer is that we have resilient organisms. They can be stressed, they can have challenges, but they're quite resilient. So what we see in organisms, we see robustness, we see plasticity, we see resilience, we see design characteristics which can be defined very specifically by design. And engineers struggle to achieve these
in machines.
And other things, and organisms have them, and it fits exactly what we would find described in the Bible. So organisms are equipped with ability to collect inputs from their external conditions. They have built-in logic centers where they can say, if this condition, then this condition. It's not happening consciously. It's happening at the cellular level. We have this logic, and they have a way to respond to those. And you know, if an input, a logic center, and an output are missing, any one of those are missing, whether it's a God-made thing or a man-made thing, it cannot adjust. You have to have all three of those together in organisms in order to get them working. You can have a feedback in order to make it adaptable. So how do we see this in a man-made thing? You have a car. It has cruise control. I don't know how much you get to use it around the Pittsburgh area.
Not too much.
Not too much. But if
Hills, turns.
Right. Well, it has the exact same things. It has an input, it has a logic center, and it has an output, but it is all self-contained. So the car has a sensor somewhere that's sensing its speed, and it'll be sending data to a computer somewhere where it's going to do something with that data, and then there'll be an output to the throttle on that car to adjust it. Now this is the important thing. The hill does not adjust the speed of your car. The hill is not doing it. Your car is sensing itself. The hill is just there or it's not there. The car is sensing itself, and it has its own self-contained system to adjust its own speed. So in terms of true engineering causality, what's causing the car to speed up and slow down? The cause is in the car. The hill is just there. Let me give you another one. I put you on an airplane, and the airplane's on autopilot, and it has ground tracking radar. And you start to fly towards a mountain, and it's all working properly, and you're a passenger, and it gets towards a mountain, and it flies over the mountain and flies back down because of the radar and the automated pilot. We want to figure out the causality. What's going to happen to you if I turn the ground following radar off?
You're going to hit the mountain.
You will hit the mountain. So the mountain is
not causing
it. It's all internally contained. And this is really an important concept for all of us to get down.
This is fascinating. I want to pick up with this in a moment where we have to take a break. Stay with us. We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Origins. We're talking to Dr. Randy Guliuzza, who's been sharing about the incredible adaptabilities of creatures we see in the world. Randy, we left off talking about a Mercedes and cruise control.
That's right, and how everything inside of it is a self-contained entity in terms of how it adjusts itself to hills and valleys and everything else like that.
And around Pittsburgh, anybody that's ever put the car on cruise control knows you all of a sudden you're going up a hill and you can hear the engine, and sometimes you'll even go into passing gear, and the car's just doing that so you can stay at that speed.
And it all begins with a sensor. Now, sensors kind of don't get much respect in the biological world, but they ought to, because everything really revolves around and begins with your ability to detect what's happening outside of you, and that all starts with a sensor. Now, we're familiar with our 5 senses, and they're very important, and other creatures have those senses as well. But there are many, many, many other things that can be detected, and we don't have nearly enough time to talk about them. But let me just give you an example of one that's kind of cool. You see this picture of all these marigolds, and you look real close, and there's a bumblebee. It's there pollinating it. Well, why does a bee sometimes go to one flower and not another flower? Well, what's interesting is the marigolds, like all living things, give off a tiny little electric field, and we now know that bumblebees actually have a sensor for electric fields.
Wow.
They can detect the electric field of a flower, and they can tell when one flower has been pollinated and another hasn't because a previous bumblebee changes the electric field. We can't see them, we're totally blind to them, but bees can see them, and creatures can see all different kinds of things. And I'll bet you we're going to find all different kinds of sensors on human beings that we didn't even know about the more we look, and then we're going to find incredible capacity with us.
That's amazing. So God has designed this bee with the ability to know flower's already been pollinated, go to the next one, and it feels that, maybe not, that's not the best word, but it senses it somehow in this sensor that it's been given, and it knows.
It knows. It does. And sensors are the key to everything. They are the input in order for organisms to adapt or track changes or track anything that's happening. Then after we detect them, we have to have an ability to track those changes. And what's really important, what we're really interested in this, is the ability to track changes over time, maybe even over multiple generations. Not just your ability to track changes in your lifetime, but maybe an ability where you can pass on information that your offspring are able to detect, that they can track changes over time. That's really what's happening.
And organisms we're seeing have the ability to do that.
Yes, they do. Let me show you maybe
That's
a couple
fascinating.
of interesting experiments here, which are dealing with really the output on our chart that begins with an input, a logic center, and proceeds over there to an output. Here's a fascinating experiment. Mice can warn sons and grandsons of dangers via sperm. Now, what these scientists and researchers did is they took male mice and they had them sitting on a little metal pad, and they would expose them to a cherry blossom odor, something like a cherry blossom odor, and the moment they were exposed, they would run an electric current that would shock their feet. Painful, but not lethal. And they would expose them, shock them, expose them, shock them, expose them, shock them. Then they took those male mice and they mated them with female mice that had never been exposed to cherry blossom odors ever. She had pups, and unfortunately what these researchers do is they sacrifice the pups, and they dissect through the olfactory region of their nose, and they're looking for any changes there, and sure enough, they found changes. Here are the sensors and the nerves for a control group. And here are sensors and nerves for those who are not exposed to cherry blossom odors, but these are the nerves and sensors for those exposed to cherry blossom odors of pups that have never been exposed to it themselves. They inherited that information not via their genes, but they got it from their father. And the paper said, such information would be an efficient way for parents to inform their offspring about the importance of specific environmental features that they are likely to encounter in their future environments.
Wow.
Passed on from father to offspring, genetically the same. In other words, there's no change in the genes.
Sure, it's still a complete mouse. It has nothing nearer than
right.
anything else.
But there were changes in how those genes were regulated so that they could express specific sensors for cherry blossom odors just by their fathers being exposed to that. Now, let's go back to those blind cavefish that we needed to look inside and find out what's happening there. You have a parent cavefish, sided, pigmented, living in a stream, and suddenly it finds itself in a cave environment. Suddenly in a cave environment. How in the world could it ever go from that to this? Well, as it says here in the paper, there's a change in a protein called heat shock protein 90, which causes the loss of eyes in the cavefish. Now the story we're normally told is, this fish has eyes, it gets in the caves, it bumps its eyes, and over a period of time it loses the eyes because they are a detriment to that fish. But you know what? By experimentation, we're able to find out that this sided fish is able to detect changes in the cave, actually in the cave water. In not many generations, within one generation, it can express offspring that during development have no eyes, no pigmentation, and they're ready to live in that cave by themselves.
Wow.
Features inside the organisms enabling them to track their environmental changes. So we can ask the question when we look inside the fish, and we can say definitively, environments do not shape organisms over time. Creatures shape themselves over time. They are active dynamic, problem-solving entities which drive themselves through time, able to track environmental changes.
That is fascinating. I hope we can talk about this again sometime. I hope you'll be able to join us again.
I do too.
Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much.
And I want to thank you for being with us. We saw today that the adaptability that is observable in all creatures, evolutionists say that the environment is causing that adaptability, but the evidence, all of the evidence, says without any exception that it is the creature itself, it is mechanisms within the creature responding to different environments that allow it to adapt. And it's proof, once again, of intelligence, of purpose. We like to say on this show, and I think we can say it again after today's program, we know what the Bible says is true, and the proof, it's all around you. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Origins, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching this edition of Origins. For a DVD of this series, you can order online or send a $12 donation to cover shipping and handling. And write to Origins Program, number 1906, Cornerstone Network, Wall, Pennsylvania, 15148.
This presentation was made possible by the faithful prayers and financial support of you, our Cornerstone family.